Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate that you spend your time with us. Whatever time that is that you choose to come and listen to this teaching, we're just very, very thankful. We had quite a few more visitors last week, and that was really exciting also. So thank you for your time, and please share this message with your friends. We really appreciate that. You can subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and if you make sure you like us and share, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are in what number is this? I think this is the 18th. Yep, this is the 18th time that Paul has referenced spiritually spoken worship in the book of Romans. Now, Stephen taught pretty extensively on that a little bit last week too, about how Paul is not saying spiritually spoken worship or speaking in tongues, but he has these different references to it that when you exegete scriptures, when you know what you're looking for, it's all in there, and it's really exciting. And I can tell you, you really do start to understand it, and you start to see it when you're reading scriptures on your own. So this is number 18, and it's in Romans 7:25. Give thanks to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. That's the first part of 7:25. You can put that up if you want to, Stephen. Give thanks to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I find myself. Can't even read today. So then, on the one hand, I myself serve with the mind the law of God, but on the other hand, with the flesh, the law of sin. We're not going to get into all of that, but I have really enjoyed reading Stephen's commentary about that, and he has this titled from Romans 7:14, Every Christian, old man wars against inner man. So you're all familiar with that part of the passage, but this is ending this passage with give thanks to God through Jesus Christ. And I want to read this one part out of his commentary for you. So Paul was making reference to a particular kind of spiritual thanksgiving to God that must be mediated through Jesus Christ, our Lord. This spiritual thanksgiving is the believer's spirit-enabled contribution of obedience to the sanctifying process. So Paul was continuing to unpack his theology of sanctifying justification. He's going to further unpack that in Romans 8. Now, Stephen's not teaching on Romans 8, but I am going to go to all of the references that Paul has in spiritually spoken worship. But when we're reading this, and this is all about give thanks, I want to go to another location where Paul first references this, and that's in the text in the chapter 1, Romans 1:8. And Stephen has that titled, Thanks to God Through Jesus Christ in Prayers of Spiritual Worship. Now, we taught on that. That was the second instance that this was taught on. So let me read this to you. Indeed, first I give thanks to my God through Jesus Christ concerning all of you, because your faith is being declared in the whole world. For Paul, my witness is God, to whom I worship in my spirit, in the good message of his Son, how I constantly do remembrance of you, always during my prayers, pleading if somehow now at last I will be prospered in the will of God to come to you. So if we go back to the first part, indeed, first I give thanks to my God through Jesus Christ concerning all of you, because your faith is being declared in the whole world. For my witness is God, to whom I worship in my spirit. When you think back to the teaching that you have received under the spiritual teachers that you have sat on, how have they taught in my spirit? I don't know how to worship in my spirit as I'm talking to you. As this human, I don't know how to worship in my spirit. I know how to worship in my mind. I know how to worship with my words. But for me to worship in my spirit, I have to take my mind and my words out of it. That's what worshiping in my spirit is. So I would be really interested if any of you would send me a message at robin.goodall@lbcdfw.org and tell me, what is it that worshiping, I worship in my spirit? What have you been taught about that? And what do you believe that that means? I just find it very interesting. And again, when I tell you the hermeneutic that Legacy Bible Church teaches answers all those questions. Does it not make sense that worshiping in my spirit is worshiping in spirit and truth, is worshiping in a spiritual prayer language? When we first were going to church and Stephen became a believer, and he read that Paul said he was thankful that he prayed in tongues more than all of you. He had a fire to understand what that means, because it was Paul. I mean, if Paul does this, I want this. So as we were talking about it, one of our children said, well, duh, of course God talks in spirit. What do we think he is? He just sits there and he does everything in English? That's the mind of a child. That's the faith of a child. That's a child without indoctrination in her. So remember, indoctrinating is teaching a viewpoint, a hermeneutic. We are teaching the hermeneutic that God wants spiritually spoken worship. So when you give thanks to God, you're giving thanks to God in spiritual worship. In spirit and in truth, you are setting your mind aside and you are teaching him. Steve has just cut his little finger right here, and so he's getting himself a Band-Aid before he comes up here. Anyway, that's a bit of a long teaching on that, and I just want you to look, not in every instance, but give thanks to God in Christ Jesus. That is spiritually spoken worship. So we thank you so much for joining this part of the teaching, and Stephen will be here and he will continue his teaching in James chapter 3. He's going to be in 5b through 12. So open up your Bibles and remember, compare those translations. You can always screenshot his Stavros the Wooden Bible and look at a difference, and you'll see where you start seeing this hermeneutic. Thanks for joining us, and here comes Steve.
All right. Good morning or good afternoon, Legacy Bible Church. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Robin, for that teaching from Paul. And yes, Paul has many different phraseologies and metaphors and figurative terms referring to that end purpose of God into spiritually spoken worship. We are in the second half of the first half of chapter 3 of the letter from James. So last week I talked about verses 1 through 5a, and I always say I'm going to try not to be repetitive, but that's really difficult to do because in order to demonstrate the cohesiveness of the letter from James, that it is a very structured rhetorical argument, it really is necessary to go back and forth and refer to things that you've talked about in previous sections and even things that haven't been talked about in later sections to show that what we're talking about in the current passage is really cohesive and integral to other things that James has said. He's not, as I said last week, James is not just a hodgepodge of sayings, Jewish sayings that have been thrown together, but rather from beginning to end, it's a very cohesive argument. And as I've said often, and is so important to understand as we're working our way through James, that he's making the case, his primary literary purpose is to make the case for the continuance of the law of Moses into the new covenant age. The law of Moses in the Jewish context and in James' context, James is representing here a latter Judaized form of Christianity where the original apostolic tradition has been syncretized with Moses. And so James is representing that syncretized Judaized gospel, what Paul called in Galatians 1:6, where you'll see Paul referred to the other euangelion, the heteros euangelion. Paul is referring to the same Christian tradition that James is representing in the letter from James. And that has everything to do with, for James, for the Judaized context, continuance of the law of Moses into the new covenant age. As I've said often throughout this teaching, for James and for this Judaized tradition, what counts toward salvation is accumulating credits, spiritual credits from doing works of the law. When you do works of the law, those become credits to your account that offset the sins that are done during life. And so I use that metaphor of the scales of justice. You want your good works to outweigh your sins so that in the final judgment, the hope is, in the Judaized context, the hope is, because in the Judaized context, you can never be sure, the hope is that you'll have enough good works to your credit to offset your sins and to be saved. That's the Judaized context. That is the plan of salvation according to the Judaized view of God's salvation plan that James is representing in the gospel. And that's very contrary to Pauline theology, where Paul is saying that the law of Moses was never efficacious for salvation. The law of Moses was only good to shine a light on sin and to cause the Israelites to long for, look forward to the day when God would send the Messiah who would become the solution to sin. But instead of that, under deception from the evil one, from Satan, under deception from his messengers, from the demonic realm, the Jews took the law of Moses, basically turned it upside down and said, well, if God has given us the law, the Ten Commandments, the moral law, among other things, then as we do the law, as we in our flesh do works of the law, then through that, we're attaining to the righteousness of God and getting those credits, those markers to our credit that'll count on our behalf at the eschatological final judgment. And so that has everything to do with when James makes reference to having works or having works. That was in the end of the second half of chapter 2. To have works is subsequent to doing works. When you do a work, that's when you're actually doing it. And in doing it, you're attaining to the righteousness of God in that punctiliar moment when you're doing a work of the law. And then afterwards, having done the work of the law, you then have that work to your credit. So that's what's meant by having works. And so this is all part and parcel to the argument that that James is making through his letter that he consequently wrote on the heels of Paul's first missionary journey into South Galatia, where Paul went into South Galatia, and essentially his teaching was that the dispensation of Moses was over. This is now a new dispensation, a dispensation of faith in the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and that in the Pauline context of salvation, a human being can do nothing that credits towards his salvation. It begins with a sovereign work of God to give faith to believe. There's no credit to the believer for receiving that faith. God gives faith sovereignly as a free gift, even when we were still enemies of God. He gives faith to believe, and that's the means by which we can believe that God has a son, Jesus Christ. He sent his son into the world as a human being to die on a cross for the forgiveness of sins, and he raised Jesus from the dead, and Jesus ascended to the throne of God, where he is seated now on the eternal throne, as the king of the kingdom of God. And there is now in this new age of this age of the new covenant, this new dispensation that comes on the heels of surpassing the dispensation of Moses. I don't want to say succeeding, but surpassing. Those words, succeeding and surpassing, are important because succeeding infers that there was something wrong with Moses. There was something wrong with the dispensation of Moses. But for its own season, for its dispensation, Moses was perfect for its dispensation. But when Jesus came, when the Messiah came, that dispensation ended, and there was a new dispensation of Jesus Christ, the advent of Jesus. And we're in that dispensation now. So Moses has sunsetted. He has been surpassed, is the word that Paul uses. Not succeeded, as if there was something wrong with Moses, but surpassed, as in the historical salvation plan of God is progressive, it's moving on. And so the historical salvation plan of God has moved on from Moses. And Moses ended with the cross. And just as Jesus was on the cross, and he said, I think that's in John 1, I believe it's John 1:30. John 1:28, John 1:30, Jesus from the cross said, it is tetelestai, it is finished, it is completed. And when you should ask, well, what is it? What was completed? The dispensation of Moses. You recall that he had just been given the bitter wine from the jar of bitter wine that was there at the location of the cross. And right after he was given that bitter wine, which represents Moses, bitter wine, old wine, right? Wine, when it gets old, becomes bitter. Old wine has no value for salvation. That's why it's bitter wine. And so after Jesus tasted that bitter wine, he said, it is finished. The bitter wine is finished, because with his death on the cross and his being seated after 3 days on raised from the dead and seated on high, he now is the salvation plan of God is no longer represented by bitter wine, but the new wine that has value, is effective to be our solution to the sin problem, effective for salvation. So this is the surpassing of Moses that Pauline theology represents. And that is not represented in Moses. In Moses, the emphasis is continuity between the old dispensation of Moses into this new dispensation of faith in the Messiah. There's, in the Jamesian view, there is full continuity. We've talked about this as if you've been with us through our all the teachings on James, you will know how James makes that case, especially when he talks about with a term in, I think it's in 1:4, aplos, meaning singular, that God is often translated in your English translations as generous, that God is generous. No, singular is the meaning of aplos, meaning that he doesn't vary from the giving of the law under Moses to this new dispensation of faith. That Torah, God is singular. He doesn't do something that is not going to continue to be effective. This is a Jamesian view. And so that Moses remains in full effect and full force as the means to salvation in the new covenant dispensation of faith. That is what I mean by the Jamesian view of continuity with Moses. There's continuity into the new dispensation of faith, into the new covenant with Moses. The Jamesian view which is important to maintaining peace with the Jews and holding at bay their persecution, the Jamesian view is that Moses is still in full effect, which Paul would have no part of. Paul was teaching in the diaspora, going into the synagogue, just like he did in South Galatia, and he is saying that Moses has been surpassed. And of course, that threw the Jews into an uproar. They stoned Paul to death at Lystra. Word of that got back to Jerusalem. There was a high risk of resumed persecution against the church at Jerusalem because of this noise, this storm, what James calls a forest fire. We're going to hear about that here in today's teaching, this forest fire that was set and was raging in South Galatia because of Paul's teaching, getting back to Jerusalem, threatening to bring resumed persecution at Jerusalem. Recall that the letter from James was written in AD 48, and it was only 5 years earlier that James the Apostle was beheaded by King Herod Agrippa I in AD 43. So these are all, this is the swirl, the milieu of events that's going on that prompted, motivated James to write his letter that basically said to the Jewish community that whatever this guy is teaching in South Galatia, that's not what we hold to. Our church here at Jerusalem and what we teach to that the sect of the way, the believers in the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who are part of the synagogue communities in the diaspora, what we are teaching them is that Moses is still effective. Moses is still fully continuous into this new age of the Messiah. That's what James would say to the Jewish community. That's what we believe. That's what we're teaching. And that's what James is representing in his letter that went out to the 12 tribes of the diaspora. His letter is going out to the Jews, to the synagogue communities in the diaspora, because that's where the Christians were mostly Jewish Christians, and they were a sect within, under the authority of the Jewish synagogue communities in the diaspora, wherever they were. The Christian communities were not separate at that time, at that stage. They were not separate from the synagogues. The only exception to that is Antioch. And we've talked about that. Antioch, the Christian community at Antioch being separate from the synagogue was an anomaly. It was new. It was the first experience of the church, broadly speaking, where Christians, especially Gentile Christians, were fellowshipping and having community outside of the Jewish community, outside of the synagogue community. Antioch was an anomaly. It was the first. It would be the pattern that Paul would be exposed to in AD 46 that would give him the confidence that, this is what it means to take the gospel to the Gentiles, that they can indeed exist outside of the synagogue communities. So this is the swirl of things that are going on in AD 46, 47, AD 48, the Jewish council meeting in Jerusalem in AD 49. This is the swirl of things. And Paul wrote Galatians in AD 48 as a response to the letter from James. So Galatians was his first letter that he is responding directly to the letter from James. And then subsequent to his writing the letter to the Galatians, they sent a team from Antioch up to Jerusalem and had the Jerusalem council meeting of AD 49 that you can read about in Acts chapter 15. This is the swirl of events that is surrounding the writing of the letter from James. And James is the champion. He's the leader of the church at Jerusalem, for one thing, which makes him, by default, if you will, the leader of the church at Jerusalem is the leader of the uh, faith communities, the sect that is existing in the synagogue communities in the diaspora. The leader of the church at Jerusalem would be the leader of the faith communities spread throughout the diaspora, every bit as much, and just like the chief priests of the temple structure at Jerusalem were the leaders of the synagogue Jewish communities throughout the diaspora. So just as the chief priests in Jerusalem were the leaders over the synagogue communities throughout the diaspora, so also in that same context, James, as the leader of the church at Jerusalem, was the de facto leader, the top gun, if you will, of the faith communities that were part of the synagogue communities throughout the diaspora. So, okay, this is the setting. This is the historical milieu that you have to be aware of if you're going to understand what James is arguing for, what his literary purpose is, and therefore to be able to make sense out of and to understand his very cryptic, typical in Jewish writing, figurative, metaphorical language. And this is our ninth session, Robin? Eighth or ninth? Whatever it is.
It's the ninth.
This is our ninth session in James. And one of the things that you should be well aware of by now is the very figurative language that James uses. He uses figurative terms. We talked a lot about that last year. We talked about horses and bits and bridles and large ships blown by the wind that are guided by a small rudder. And we talked about how all those metaphors related right back to the end of chapter 2 with the Abrahamic example. This is how James is arguing. Very figurative, a very cohesive argument, but you have to understand what his literary purpose is, and you have to understand something about Jewish history and Jewish context to make sense out of what James is saying. But the main thing that I want you to get, the main thing I want you to know is James is representing and he is exhorting the Christian communities in the diaspora who are under the synagogue authority in the diaspora. They're still part of the Jewish community, still under the synagogue, that he is representing continuance of Moses. And that's why, for instance, in Acts 15:1, Luke writes that men from Judea went to Antioch teaching, except that you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Now, that's all the way the Antioch incident that's represented there occurred in AD 48, right after the mission trip into South Galatia and the writing of the letter from James. Then suddenly these men come from Judea and they're teaching the Gentiles there at Antioch that you have to be circumcised according to the customs of Moses if you're going to be a part of and participate in and benefit from the salvation plan of God. Aside from obedience to Moses, there's no salvation in the salvation plan of God. This is all the way 15 years after the cross, and this is the teaching that's coming out of the church at Jerusalem, men from Jerusalem. That's why Paul would write in Galatians chapter 2, verse 12. You can see it. It's clear as day that Paul writes there about this Antioch incident, the same incident that Luke wrote about in Acts 15:1. Paul is writing about in Galatians chapter 2. And in verse 12, he writes that certain men from James, those from the circumcision, came from Jerusalem. These are the same men. They're teaching that you have to be circumcised if you're going to participate in the salvation plan of God. And make no mistake about it, one thing to understand about this whole debate and argument about circumcision is that to be circumcised in the flesh represents your allegiance to the totality of the tradition, customs of Moses, the law of Moses. To be circumcised in the flesh is not just a sort of an anomalous token gesture. No, to be circumcised in the flesh is to represent your complete allegiance to Moses. And that becomes much more clear just ahead in Acts 15:5, where the Pharisaical believers at Jerusalem are say in so many words that they have to be circumcised in order to meet all the demands, all the requirements of Moses. That circumcision in the flesh is a physical sign that represents allegiance to the totality, not partial, not just the moral law, but the totality of the customs of Moses, which includes not least the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments, but also the full liturgical structure that was fostered at Jerusalem for the atonement of sins, all of that. Okay, long lead in here. I like to give those reviews because it's important to keep fresh and current the mindset about the whole historical milieu that's taking place here as the letter of James is written, as it's delivered to Antioch, as it prompts Paul to begin his writing career with the letter from Galatians, the Jerusalem council meeting, et cetera, et cetera. Very important to have that historical context. So, okay, let's read through this second half. I think what I will do, Robin, we will start with verse 1. I'm going to read quickly through verses 1 through 5a, which I talked about in our last session last week in session number 8. I'll continue with 5b through 12 today, but let's start with that first passage. It's titled Bridle the Tongue, James chapter 3, verses 1 through 5a. Up, Robin? Let not many of you become teachers, my brothers, knowing that we will receive greater judgment, for we all stumble much. If anyone does not stumble under the Logos word, this one is a perfect Andre man, also able to bridle the whole body. But if we put bits into the mouths of horses for them to obey us, we also guide their whole body. Behold, also the ships, being so large and being driven by strong winds, are guided by a tiny rudder where the whim of the one piloting plans to go. So also the tongue is a small member and proudly boasts of great things. Taught on that last week. Go listen to last week's teaching if you want to know what all of that means. Packed, just pregnant with meaning in these figurative terms. Okay, next passage I'm going to teach on today. The tongue is a fire, verses 3.5b to verse 12. 5b, behold, how so small a fire kindles up so great a forest. And so the tongue is a fire, the ordering of injustice. The tongue is constituted among our members, defiling the whole body, both setting on fire the machinery of biological life and being set on fire by Gehenna. For every kind of nature, both beasts and birds, both crawling creatures and sea creatures, is tamed and has been tamed by human nature. But no one is able to tame the tongue of men. It is unstable, evil, the fullness of deadly poison. With it, we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made according to the likeness of God. From the same mouth goes out blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to happen this way. A spring does not pour forth from the same opening both fresh and bitter water, does it? A fig tree is not able, my brothers, to produce olives, is it? Or a vine to produce figs? Neither is salty water able to produce fresh water. And that is the end of the first half, the major passage of James 3, 1 through 12, that I have titled Discontinuity, Unbridled Teachers. Unbridled teachers, because the idea here that James is representing is pointing to Paul and teachers that follow Paul's teaching that would teach that Moses is finished, teaching that ostensibly to forsake Moses. In AD 57, when Paul wrote Romans and went to Jerusalem, Luke writes in Acts, in chapter 21 of Acts, that when Paul got to Jerusalem, the first thing James did is chastise Paul, because Paul was teaching the Jews in the nations, in the diaspora, to forsake Moses. And he says, and was even teaching fathers not to have their newborn sons circumcised. Paul was chastised for that 8 years after this whole milieu of the letter from James and Galatians and the Antioch incident and the Jerusalem council meeting. 8 years later, Paul goes to his final trip to Jerusalem and is chastised, and James sends him to the temple to be cleansed. James is still in AD 57 as passionate for the law of Moses as he is representing here in the letter from James in AD 48. So verse 5b, this comes on the heels of 5a, where he finished the previous minor section. So also the tongue is a small member and proudly boasts great things. Begins the new section here. The tongue is a fire, and he's pointing at Paul. I want to read you my lead-in paragraph for verse 3.5b. That starts my own commentary on this new passage here. James has his rhetorical finger pointed squarely at the voice of the Pauline mission, which only recently kindled up a great forest, that is, the Jewish communities in South Galatia, with his grace-centered teaching that declares Christ as the end of the law of Moses. I give Romans 10:4 as a reference for that. Such an idea was considered apostasy against the covenant of God of Israel, not only by the broader Jewish communities, both in Judea and the diaspora, but also by the James-led church at Jerusalem. To speak against the Pauline mission and such apostasy is the purpose and thesis of both James' letter and his newly launched counter mission from Jerusalem. As I quoted earlier here, quoting again, certain men away from James, those from the circumcision, that's Paul in Galatians 2:12, who were teaching that, and now here's Luke in Acts 15:1, who were teaching that, except ever you might be circumcised in the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. That's the lead in my commentary for this new passage. So, behold how so small a fire, the teaching of Paul, kindles up so great a forest. And the forest is the trees. Trees are often in Jewish literature and parlance a figurative representation of a man. A tree is often a figurative representation of a man. So here a forest is a representation of a community of many men. And the representation here is the diaspora synagogue communities. Remember that James addressed his letter to the 12 tribes of the diaspora. This is the great forest. The great forest is specifically here pointing to having reference to the synagogue communities of South Galatia that literally went into an uproar with this new teaching of Paul that had occurred only less than a year before James wrote this letter. Behold how so small a fire, James or Paul's teaching, kindles up so great a forest, the synagogue communities of South Galatia. Verse 6, and so the tongue is a fire, the ordering of injustice. What I want to say there is the ordering is, the word is hakosmos, kosmos. It's the same word that is most often translated as the world. Hakosmos would be normally translated, and often even in the letter from James, there are, I think, about a half a dozen uses of hakosmos that is normally, and I normally translate it as the world. But here, it is the ordering of injustice. We could easily have just translated the world of injustice. It's referring to the world outside of the synagogue communities where Torah is taught, where works of the law are done to attain ostensibly to the righteousness of God. But outside of the synagogue communities is the world. And the world is still governed by Satan. Remember that strong wind driving the large ship. The world is still governed by Satan. So the world of injustice, the world cosmos, that word cosmos, and the cognate verb, I think is kosmeo, has to do with bringing things into a certain order. That's why the world derives from the word cosmos, because the world, as God's creation, is his ordering of material things. Cosmos, that's where the word cosmology, you've probably heard that word cosmology, is the study of creation, the study of the creation, cosmology. And it has to do with the meaning of ordering. So when I refer here to the tongue is, the tongue is a fire. The fire is the ordering of injustice, the world of injustice. It's the arranging, bringing into a certain kind of order. And this kind of order, the tongue as a fire, representing evil. The tongue is bringing evil into the world, and is the certain kind of ordering of the ruler of this world of evil, an ordering of injustice. I hope you're seeing that. That's the context. That's the meaning here of the ordering of injustice. It's the type of creation, if you will, that the ruler of this world is bringing into the creation. The ruler of this world, Satan, can only bring injustice into the world. That's the very nature, the very essence of the creative working of the evil one. Satan is injustice. It's the exact opposite of the type of creative working of God. When God does creative working and he brings his creative working into the world, it's righteous, it's perfect, it's holy. It's justice, bringing his judgment, his righteous judgment into the world. But Satan, in the context of what he can do through the tongues of man, is to bring injustice, the opposite of what God does, into the world. So the tongue is a fire, the ordering of injustice. I want you to hear there. It's so important to hear there. When you hear that, the tongue is a fire, means it's doing evil. The ordering of injustice is doing the bidding of Satan. And you're going to see this more in this passage as it progresses here. The ordering of injustice is doing the bidding of Satan, the evil one. The tongue, continuing in verse 6, the tongue is constituted by God, is constituted among our members. And so the point here that James is making, since the tongue is part of the members of our body, it defiles the whole body. The tongue is a fire. When it's doing the bidding of Satan, the tongue is the source of defiling the whole body. because the tongue releasing evil in the world, being the ordering of injustice, is the source of the body being used to do transgressions of the law, to do sin. You see that? The tongue, being the ordering of injustice, is the cause and the source of human beings then using their body to sin. These are the connections here. The tongue is constituted among our members, defiling the whole body, both setting on fire the machinery of biological life and being set on fire by Gehenna. So what James is saying there is just kind of a continuance of what he has just said, is that the tongue sets on fire the machinery of biological life here. The machinery of the word for machinery is often used in ancient literature for like agricultural implements or weapons of war even. This is the terminology used for machinery. So in the context of biological life, the body is the machinery. It's God-given, God-created. You'll hear here in just a minute that it's created by God according to the likeness of God. And that has a reference to the hardware, if you will, of God's creation of the human being, the hardware being the body and the soul. And so the machinery of biological life is corrupted by the evil tongue, because ultimately when the tongue does evil, bringing the ordering of injustice into the world, that the net result, the net cause from that is that the body is going to be caused from that to do injustice, to do evil, to sin, to transgress the law. So the tongue is constituted among our members, defiling the whole body, both setting on fire the machinery of biological life. The body here, by our evil volition, then being caused to do evil, injustice, to sin. And it says, and being set on fire by Gehenna. And this is James' way of saying that the tongue is set on fire by the evil one. It's the same thing as I'll just say the same thing. I was going to say very similar, but it's essentially the same thing that Jesus was referring to when in Matthew chapter 16, he's having that dialogue with his disciples, and he's saying, who do the people say that I am? They gave him a couple of answers for who they're saying he is. Some say Elijah, some say John the Baptist, yada, yada. And Jesus said, well, who do you say I am? And Peter responds and says, you are the Messiah and the Son of the living God. And Jesus responded to Peter with both the near purpose and end purpose of God's salvation plan. He said, you wouldn't know that, Simon Bar-Jonah, you wouldn't know that except my Father in heaven revealed that to you. So even though Jesus has been with them for a long time by that point, Jesus doesn't give himself credit that Peter knows that he is the Messiah and the Son of the living God. Jesus, standing there with his disciples, acknowledges that it's my Father who gives that revelation, not me, Jesus said, gives him that revelation. Then Jesus said, but on this rock, what rock? This rock as the revelation of who Jesus is given by the Father. That's faith. On this rock, I will build my church, Jesus said, and the gates of Hades will not come against it. So Jesus is essentially referencing here that the human mind is the source, through the tongue, is the source of Satan, the demonic realm, having entry into the world. Comes through bad teaching, bad tradition that infects the mind of human beings, out of which the tongue speaks. The tongue is set on fire. And so James is acknowledging here the source of setting the tongue of a human being on fire, that the source of setting the tongue of a human being on fire is Satan himself, through the demonic realm, who infect the minds of human beings with deception, with bad teaching and bad tradition, out of which evil things are spoken, bringing the ordering of the evil one into the world, injustice, the doing of sins and transgressions by human bodies. It all comes from a tongue set on fire, which has its source in Gehenna, in the realm of Satan. The same thing when Jesus said, I'm going to build my church on the revelation of who I am given to you, my disciples, by my Father in heaven. And the gates of Hades, Gehenna, the source of evil and sin, through the mouth, through the mind and through the mouth of human beings, will not come against my work to build my church. Why? Because in the end purpose of God's salvation plan, the spirit regenerated disciples must die to self. That's why Jesus said, unless you deny yourself, take up your cross and come after me, you cannot be my disciples. That's the dying to self. Same thing Paul meant in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 31. If you want to see a reference, he's talking to the Corinthian church, writing them a letter. He hasn't seen them in over 3 years, but he says in this letter, I die for you every day. And Paul is only referencing there his obedience from faith to die to self into spiritually spoken worship. That in that realm of spiritually spoken worship, he is participating with God on behalf of the church. That's why he could say to the Corinthians, I die daily for you. That's what Jesus meant when he said that the gates of Hades will not come against it. His building of the church, his bringing salvation into the creation through his disciples, which his salvation into the creation is the building for the purpose of the building of his church. And so James is representing all of that here when he talks about the tongue being set on fire. The tongue speaking evil has its source in Gehenna, in the evil one, in Satan. Satan is the source of setting the tongue on fire. And the tongue, human tongue, being set on fire, releasing evil, bringing the ordering of injustice in the world, then is the source of human beings then doing evil with their bodies. This is James' argument here. This is what he's saying here. So we go verse 7 now, right into God's created order, right? He just talked about the ordering of injustice. Now James kicks right into Genesis 1:26 and God's ordering of the world, of his creation. For every kind of nature, both beasts and birds, both crawling creatures and sea creatures, is tamed and has been tamed by human nature. All James is saying here, this is just a way of saying that God has placed in the created order that human beings will be his vice regents in the created order. Human beings are God's designated ones to rule over all the other creatures. That's all he's saying here. He's contrasting the ordering of injustice that has its source in Gehenna with the intended purpose of God that human beings would be responsible for the ordering of the created beings that he calls the beasts and the birds. Those are the land, the animals of the four-footed animals of the land, and the birds of the air, and then the crawling creatures that crawl on the ground, and the sea creatures in the sea, that they are tamed by human nature, by human beings. God has created them and put them under the jurisdictions of human nature. That's all he's saying here. So he's contrasting here that Satan is the author of the ordering of injustice. God is the author of the ordering of all the created beings in the creation, and that he put created beings under the human being. But the human being has a tongue through which the ordering goes out into the creation that is being used by Satan, being set on fire by Satan. I hope you're seeing this. This is what James is representing here. This is the problem of fallen man, of sin in the world that has infected the world ever since the fall. That's what James is representing here. It's a good, accurate picture of the problem. And the only problem with James is he's representing the solution as Moses, as the teaching of Torah and doing works of the law. Ultimately, that's James' solution. It's a very Jewish concept. That's James representing a very Jewish concept of the solution to the sin problem. Very different than Pauline theology. Verse 8, but no one is able to tame the tongue of man. God has given man sovereignty over his tongue. Catch that there. God has given human beings a free will. And so they have sovereign jurisdiction over their tongue, which is to say they have sovereign jurisdiction over what they think, which then governs what they say. It gets back to, again, about teaching and doctrine. Paul talked about doctrines of demons and traditions of men, and that's in contrast to the knowledge and the righteousness of God. So he's saying, but no one is able to tame the tongue of men. It's simply God is able to do anything he wants, but God has given human beings sovereign control and jurisdiction over their own mind, their free will, and their tongue, to either represent the ordering of injustice, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or the ordering of justice, the tree of life. A human being stands between the two and has jurisdiction over his decision or her decision. Am I going to worship under the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God has commanded, do not eat from that tree? Or am I going to worship under the tree of life, Jesus Christ? No one is able to force any human being to do one or the other. The human being has full volitional discretion as to which tree he or she is going to worship under. No one is able to tame the tongue of a human being. It is, and then here, James goes into the result of the fall. As a result of being cut off from the tree of life because of the transgression of the first man, Adam, cut off from the tree of life, there's now only one option to exercise that sovereign discretion. That option is to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It is, and that's why James can say, it is unstable, evil, the fullness of deadly poison, tree of knowledge of good and evil. I'll decide what I like and don't like. I'll decide what's good and bad. I will judge what is righteous and unrighteous. Thank you very much, God. I can take care of that all by myself. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Man, having been cut off from the tree of life, has this discretion that can only go in one direction, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Until Jesus is the tree of life. And when the Father gives faith to believe in the tree of life, a human being has open access and discretion, again, for the first time since the fall, now to choose one or the other. If I've been given faith to believe in the Son, Jesus Christ, to believe that he is the Messiah and the Son of the living God, which Jesus said is only revealed to a human being by his Father, then I stand again in the middle of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and I can now choose, where am I going to worship under? What tree am I going to eat from? I now have that discretion. I now have that latitude. If you want to read about Paul's rendering of when James says that the tongue is unstable, evil, the fullness of deadly poison, read Romans chapter 3, verses 9 through 11. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. That would be worth reading at this point. And I do think I've got it. Here it is, starting at, this starts at verse 10. Romans chapter 3, verse 10. He's saying the same thing that James has said here about the tongue being unstable, evil, the fullness of deadly poison. Here's what Paul says, and he's quoting from the Psalms and from Isaiah. No, and this would be Romans chapter 3, verse 9 through 18, if you're going to. So let me read it, starting at verse 10. No one is just, not even one. No one is understanding. No one is seeking out God. All turned away. Together they've become worthless. No one is doing good. There's not even one. Their throat is a grave having been opened. They were deceiving with their tongues, venom of serpents under their lips, whose mouth is full of a curse and bitterness. Swift are their feet to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. And the way of peace, that would be peace with God, they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Paul's saying there in Romans 3, 10 through 18, the same thing that James is saying here about the tongue, that it's unstable, evil, the fullness of deadly poison. And verse 9, with it we bless the Lord and Father. And I want you to think back to the very first passage in chapter 1, where James writes about the perseverance. And that the perseverance, out of the perseverance, there's a perfecting effect. And that is the reference to the end purpose of God's salvation plan. Indeed, James believes in it, but the perfecting effect, the edification in the Jamesian context is to become better doers of the law. He finishes that passage by referring to the lowly one boasting in his exaltation. And he says that that through that, the believer is given the crown of life. That is the realm of spiritually spoken worship and blessing the Father. But there's also another way in the Jamesian view, and that's the next passage in chapter 1 that talks about then the Logos word, Torah, being quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, and doing the Logos word. This is all referring to the Mosaic law, the law of Moses. And so the realm of teachers of Torah who teach accurately, remember at the beginning of chapter 3 here, James said, let not many of us become teachers. Teachers what? Teachers of the law of Moses. Let not many of us become teachers, knowing that we will receive greater judgment. So it's by teaching the law of Moses, Torah, accurately, representing Torah well with teaching, that the tongue blesses the Father. Blesses the Father, why? Because out of teaching Torah accurately, this is the Jamesian view, this is the Judaized view of Christianity. Out of teaching Torah accurately, more human beings, ostensibly Jews, but also proselytized Gentiles, will be doing works of the law and attaining to the righteousness of God. And so to teach that is to use the tongue in a way that blesses God, because out of that, more human beings are going to do works of the law. Remember that rudder on the large ship being the Israelites guiding the nations? It's out of doing works of the law among the Gentiles that the Israelites are a rudder for the large ship representing the nations, the rudder representing the tiny nation of Israel, that through doing works of the law is guiding this big ship, the Gentile nations. That's how they are a blessing to the nations. This is how the whole argument of James fits together here, church. So we bless the Lord and Father with the tongue, whether we are lowly ones boasting in our exaltation, what Paul calls spiritually spoken worship, or in the Jamesian view, being good, faithful, accurate, precise teachers of Torah. We bless the Father. And he goes on saying, with it, we curse men. And he's using this in a very rhetorical sense, because I don't think, and this is my speculation here, how do you make sense out of this? He is exhorting that use of the tongue which blesses God, and he's discouraging that use of the tongue that would curse men. So he's got Paul in his eyesight. Paul, the one teaching to forsake Moses. Paul, that's teaching that the salvation plan of God has moved beyond Moses. That the dispensation of Jesus is only Jesus, that Moses is over. And James is representing here that is a curse to men. Why? Because to forsake Moses in the Jewish context, in the Jamesian context, to forsake Moses is to forsake the salvation plan of God. So if you're teaching men to forsake Moses, you're effectively cursing men, because they're going to fall away from their only means of salvation, which is doing works of the law. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made according to the likeness of God. And again here, remember in Genesis 1:26 to 1:28, the reference there is let us make mankind in our likeness. Let us make him in our image and according to our likeness is the verbiage. And so here, James is referencing only part of that, according to the likeness of God. James makes no reference to the image of God. Why? Because the likeness of God is accusative, quantitative, refers to the machinery of biological life. It's the hardware. And to be in the image of God is an operational realm where the machinery is being used to do righteousness. So when God said, let us make man in our image and according to our likeness, The in our image part is a dative of sphere, and it is referring to operational, effectual working, if you will. And so that is a volitional realm. So to be in the image of God is to act in obedience to the commandments of God. That's to represent the image of God. But regardless of whether we represent the image of God or the image of Satan doing unrighteousness, regardless of that, we always have had and always will have according to the likeness of God, the hardware, the quantitative portion, what James referred to earlier in this passage as the machinery of biological life, the implement, the instruments of doing biological life, the body. This is the portion of God's creation of mankind that is according to his likeness. It's the body, it's the machinery of biological life, out of which we can, those of us who are spirit regenerated, standing in the middle, out of which we can operate in the image of God, the tree of life, or according to our own image, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We're now in the middle and can have access to either or. So that's what he means when he says that, refers to cursing men who have been made according to the likeness of God. From the same mouth goes out blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to happen this way. James is exhorting, has been exhorting, teaching, and being doers of the law of Moses. And he's referring here to this idea of cursing men is pointing at Paul and his teaching that is now going out to the Gentile nations, to the synagogues, remember, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. He's going into the synagogues in the diaspora, teaching, according to James, teaching to forsake Moses and teaching men not to have their newborn sons circumcised. And so James is referring to that as cursing men. So out of the same mouth, Paul will worship in spirit and truth, blessing God. And then Paul will turn around and teach the Jews to forsake Moses and to tell men not to have their newborn boys circumcised, cursing men. Out of the same mouth, out of Paul's mouth, blessing God in spiritually spoken worship and cursing his brother Jews, telling them to forsake Moses. And he's saying, my brothers, these things ought not to happen this way. He's not denigrating blessing God. He's denigrating the teacher that would teach the Jews to forsake Moses. It shouldn't happen this way. You shall worship God in spirit and truth, and you should teach Torah. That's what you ought to do. A spring does not pour forth from the same opening both fresh and bitter water, does it? Here, the fresh water being worshiped to God. Remember when Jesus said to the Jews on the Feast of Booths, it would be in AD 32, about 6 months before the cross, on the 8th day, the great day of the feast, he stood in front of the Jews and said, are any of you thirsty? Come to me, and you will drink from your innermost. He said, if anyone thirsts, come to me, and from your innermost womb, he calls it womb, right? That infers giving birth, by the way. From your innermost womb will flow rivers of living water. And I believe this is what James is referring to here when he talks about a spring, fresh water, as alluding back to that river of living water coming from the innermost womb. That's the end purpose of God's salvation plan. I believe that's what James is referring to here. From the same mouth goes out blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things should not ought to happen this way. A spring does not pour forth from the same opening both fresh water and bitter water being forsaking Moses. Here the word bitter, I want to talk real briefly about this, is used 2 times in the Hebrew scriptures. One time with Esau when he wept bitterly when he found out he had lost the birthright. It says he wept bitterly. And the Greek text has the same term. The other one is in Exodus chapter 15 at the waters of Marah. I think it's the waters of Marah. Remember, they were bitter waters, and caused the Jews to grumble toward Moses. That's what's in view here. The bitter waters is inferring grumbling toward Moses, pointing back to the bitter waters of Marah, and the Jews who are grumbling at Moses. And the inference here, Paul and those who are following Paul's teaching, bitter water coming out of their mouth, cursing men. The word bitter alluding to grumbling against Moses, forsaking Moses. This is the reference to the bitter waters. Ties right in with the bitter waters of Marah and Exodus chapter 15. I think I'm getting that word right, Marah. But the word bitter is the same one that James uses here, and it's used only 2 times in the Hebrew scriptures. So, last verse. A fig tree is not able, my brothers, to produce olives, is it, or a vine to produce figs? Neither is salty water able to produce fresh water. So the salty water, obviously the bitter water, that is forsaking Moses. Teaching of Torah, forsaking Moses. But look at a fig tree, not able, my brothers, to produce olives, is it, or a vine to produce figs? The reference here is, again, has in view the fall of mankind. You have to tie this back. He's been doing that a lot in this verse, referring to created order and then Satan's order of injustice and the created order with the created beings, and that human beings have been placed over the created beings. So the creative event of human beings is in view here. And now with this idea of figs and fig trees versus olives and vines is placing in view the fall. What did the first man and woman do immediately after the fall? They covered themselves with fig leaves, ostensibly then the fig tree representing the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They covered themselves with fig leaves. And so James is referring to here, again in the context of the created order, referring here to the fall. And where then the olive tree and the vines, Jesus in John chapter 15, the vine is the primary metaphor that Jesus uses to refer to himself. He's the vine. That's what's in view here is Messiah. Olives and a vine in contrast with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, figs, and the fig tree. Alluding to, pointing back to the first man and the first woman after the fall, covering themselves with fig leaves. The creative event of God versus the alternative ordering under Satan, which is the ordering of injustice, is in view through this whole passage here, right up to the end, chapter 3:12, where olives and a vine are referring to the Messiah, the tree of life, and figs and the fig tree referring to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God said, do not eat from that tree. So, okay, we've kind of, believe it or not, church, we've kind of raced through this passage here, but I've given you a lot. There's a lot on the plate here. And I know that it's, especially if you're hearing this for the first time, and if you're only use to be fed 20 minutes of vegetables in your churches and teachings on topical issues, and you're not accustomed to getting deep teaching in the scriptures in a methodical way, working through it like this, till you acclimate to it, sometimes it can be hard to sit through it and keep your attention focused on it. And I understand that. So I encourage you to try to stay focused. I encourage you to listen a second time. I encourage you to pause the recording and take notes where something is said that you want to remember, or if Robin gives you an opportunity for a screenshot, you might want to write down something from the scriptures that are given in the screenshots from Stal Ross, the Wooden Bible. But my point is, take notes. When you take notes at critical, important points where something strikes you as very important and you don't want to forget it, write it down, and you will see the effectiveness of your ability to retain these things just skyrocket. Just the simple act of writing it down in notes. So thank you for being with us. We love you. We love doing this teaching, and we'll continue with the final passage in chapter 3 on wisdom. Are we going to do it next week, Robin? Yeah. Hopefully next Sunday we'll continue with the final passage in chapter 3 of the letter from James. We'll see you then. God bless you.